Science Class by CuteMochi. Mr. Willerstein has a special project planned for his 6th grade science class. Takes place after the events of the movie. Lewis, Franny, Chapter 1, A Project. Recap. Lewis has been adopted by Bud and Lucille, and it is the last quarter of 6th grade. He attends the same school that the science fair was held at. He already knows most of the kids who attend. "Have fun at school, Cornelius," Bud said, ruffling Lewis's spiky blonde hair. "I used that neat little PB&J gun you invented to make your lunch," Lucille said, handing Lewis an indigo blue lunchbox with an atom hand-embroidered on it. "Thanks, guys. You're the best," the young inventor exclaimed, hugging the two. "Make some new friends," Lucille said, kissing his forehead. "I will," Lewis called back, sprinting towards the bus. "We love you, son," Bud said. "I love you too." Lewis stepped onto the yellow school bus, which was overflowing with kids. He took an empty seat next to the window and waved goodbye to his parents, who were in front of the Robinson Manor, waving back. So far, Lewis and a few other kids were on the bus. There was an awkward silence among them. To his left, on the other set of seats, sat a glum girl with pitch-black hair tied into pigtails with black ribbons. She wore a gothic black dress with a white collar and dark gray belt with black tights and black school shoes. Her face looked an unnaturally pale gray color, and in her arms seemed to be a glass case filled with sand and tiny red fire ants. It was none other than Lizzie. The girl stoked the glass affectionately, as if regarding the ants as her own children. Suddenly she turned to Lewis, who realized he was staring. Her black eyes studied him coldly. The expression on her face seemed to say, "Look at me again, and I'll send my children after you. And it will not be pretty." Lewis took the hint and averted his eyes. He whipped out his composition notebook, which was filled with his ideas for future inventions, along with a sharpened pencil. He started to jot down notes and mathematical formulas, and sketching out the overall invention, from the exterior to the interior. The bus stopped again. At the bus stop were 3 students, all varying in height and age, but they were obviously related. One had a black t-shirt with red trim on the collar and sleeves, and dirty jeans stained with meatball sauce. The other was dressed in a long-sleeved white shirt, with red sleeves and tight jeans with boots. There was only one girl in this neighborhood, and she looked surprisingly familiar. It was Franny. She wore a sleeveless dress that was saffron yellow at the top, with a light pink ribbon belt and a navy blue skirt that was slightly above her knees. Her shiny dark hair was tied into short pigtails with yellow pom-poms. Her backpack was white and decorated with black music notes, and she had a froggy plush on her zipper. She took a seat next to the dark ant girl, who brightened slightly at the sight of Franny. "Hi, Lizzie," she said cheerfully. "Hi, Franny," the girl replied, speaking in a monotone voice. Franny glanced over her at Lewis and gasped. "Oh, hi, Lewis." Her cheeks blushed pink slightly. "Hi, Franny," he replied. She poked Lizzie's shoulder and whispered quite loudly, "That's the boy who likes my frogs." "Really?" Lizzie said, apparently uninterested. "So," Franny said, turning to face Lewis, "I heard you were adopted by Mrs. Robinson last Friday." "Yeah, I was," he said, shutting his notebook. "She and Bud are great parents." "Really? For sure. That's cool. So, about frogs having more musical ability than people." Lewis and Franny had a riveting discussion on how frogs' vocal cords differ from humans, and how they can produce different sounds. Franny was absolutely in love with Lewis's knowledge of the amphibian, and even asked to come over to Lewis's house to study and discuss the topic of frogs. Lewis couldn't help but comply. Franny's smile seemed to light up the whole sky, and her eyes were full of curiosity and wonder, like a scientist's desire to gain more knowledge. Just like Lewis. By the time Franny had scribbled down her number and vice versa, they were at the school. They slung their backpacks on their shoulders and headed off the bus. Coincidentally, Franny and Louis were both in Mr. Willerstein's class, and their first class was his signature science. "All right, class. Today we'll be studying frogs. Partner up and come tell me your partners." "Frogs? Yes!" Franny exclaimed. She quickly located Louis and dragged him by the arm towards Mr. Willerstein. "Oh, Mr. Willerstein, Louis and I have agreed to be partners, right, Louis?" she said sweetly. Yeah," Louis said, looking somewhat baffled. Mr. Willerstein raised an eyebrow, but nodded and jotted their names down on his clipboard. Franny gestured for Louis to follow her to the group table and saved a seat for him. Louis took a seat next to her, and she excitedly said, "This is so exciting! We get to study frogs." "Yeah, you're right," he said, smiling. Franny blushed. "Now, class, let's get started," he said. He pulled out a large cardboard box from underneath his desk. "What's that?" Franny asked. Maybe he brought in some frogs to perform a song. Louis's mouth tasted like rust. Franny was not going to like this project. Franny, actually it seems like—" "Not now, Louis. I'm waiting for them to start the chorus." She looked like she was about to watch a famous band's live concert. "Franny, Don't sass me, Louis. I know karate," she said. Louis closed his eyes and plugged his ears as Mr. Willerstein stuck his gloved hands into the box and pulled out a frog carcass. Franny screamed in horror and her eyes welled up. "How could you do this?" she exclaimed. "Do what?" he asked. "Kill that poor frog. He had so much potential." She sniffled. "Wait, Franny, actually this is murderer Killjoy," she said. "He could have been the next Michael Jackson." "Franny, this is just a synthetic model of a frog." "A what?" Franny asked. "He means it's just a model, not a real frog," Louis told her. "Oh," Franny said, stammering. Some kids in the class snickered. However, they all remained silent when Franny shot all death glares that said, "I will find you and kill you in your sleep." "Well, now that we've clarified some things, we can start the project. The first thing we'll be studying is Chapter 2, The Promise." "The first thing we'll be studying is," Mr. Willerstein said. Franny buried her face into her arms, ashamed. Louis elbowed her gently and said, "Hey, what's wrong?" "What's wrong?" she hissed quietly. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe I only embarrassed myself in front of the whole class." "So, we all make mistakes. All we have to do is learn from the mistakes we make and keep moving forward." Franny was silent for a second. Then she rose up and whispered, "Yeah, thanks, Louis." Mr. Willerstein walked around and handed each pair 2 pairs of gloves and a faux frog, along with a scalpel. Franny looked like she wanted to cry at the sight of the frog. It did look pretty real. "So class, today we'll be dissecting fake frogs, since the school didn't have enough money to buy real frogs." Franny's face turned a couple shades of green. If you weren't paying attention, it would look like she just got off the Batman at Six Flags Great America. Seriously, I've been on that ride, and if I hadn't taken motion sickness pills beforehand, it would have not been pleasant. "Did this dissect?" Franny asked Louis. Her voice sounded strained, like someone was strangling her by the neck. "Look at it this way," Louis said comfortingly. "At least it's not a real frog." She frowned. "But still, Louis, think of it like this. Someone cuts one of the world's greatest inventions open just to see what's inside of it." "They'd probably be doing it so they could duplicate it," he replied. Her face turned tomato red. "Well, maybe they, she stuttered. "Franny, Louis," Mr. Willerstein scolded. "Sorry," they both said. He eyed them and then returned to his lecture on how to properly cut a frog open. For a few minutes they remained silent, paying attention to the board. Well, more like Louis was. Franny sat there with her eyes closed and her hands over her ears, only daring to peek every minute or so. After a while, Louis tapped her shoulder and told her that it came time to cut the frog open. "No, I'm not doing it. I refuse to," Franny stubbornly said. Mr. Willerstein was coming around to see how each group was doing. He was only about 10 feet away. "Franny, if you do this, I'll," Louis stammered. "You'll what?" she demanded. "I'll examine the fake frog's vocal cords and come up with something to help your frog sing better," he said. "Really?" she asked in awe. "Yeah," Louis said. "Just imagine, your frog singing on Broadway, being mobbed by loving fans." She closed her eyes as if in a dream. "That would be amazing," she said longingly. "It would," he said, "but it's not official until you actually do it." "Okay," she sighed. Taking a deep breath, she picked up the scalpel and made a long cut along the frog's stomach. At first, she looked like she was about to vomit, but remembering that it was just a fake, she managed to make a clean slit along the surface of the frog's skin. "Good job," Mr. Willerstein observed, smiling at Franny and Louis. "You did good," Louis praised, patting Franny on the back lightly. "Thanks," she said shakily, eyeing the gooey intestines of the frog. "Remember, Franny, keep moving forward." "Okay. Now, class, as partners, you have to write a 3-page essay on the frog and sketch a rough model of it. You have 2 weeks. Now get ready for history." Everyone stood up to put their frogs into Ziploc bags and to grab their history books. "Remember the deal, okay?" Franny said, sticking out her pinky to Louis. "Keep in mind that I'm almost at my black belt." Louis gulped. "All right," he said, hooking pinkies with Franny. "Good," she said. "Now, you take the frog, and we can work on the project more at your house after school today." "Sure," he said. During history class, Louis constructed a mini crossbow using 3 pieces of notebook paper, a latex rubber band, a pair of scissors, and some tape. I actually did this during class, heh. "And that concludes our history class," Mr. Willerstein finished. Louis grumbled. History was so boring. Why focus on old stuff when there's science to be done? "Mr. Willerstein, why do we have history class in the first place?" Louis asked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, why do we learn about stuff that's already happened when we can focus on the future?" Mr. Willerstein paused for a moment. "Although it is important to focus on the future, Louis, there's a famous saying, we record history because if we do not, we are doomed to repeat its mistakes." "Oh, I never thought about it that way," Louis said. Mr. Willerstein smiled. "Anyways, class, let's get suited up for pre-algebra." Chapter 3, Gaston and Art. "Why not?" Franny protested. "Because," Gaston replied, stabbing his fork into a meatball. "We said so." "That's not a logical answer," Franny replied, frowning. "Franny, you know how Mom is. She's sensitive about you being around boys," her brother shot back. "But this is for a class project," she reminded him. "So?" Gaston said, wiping the sauce from his face. "So, if I don't go over to Louis's house to work on the project, then I get a failing grade, or a CT at the least, and I do not need that tarnishing my 4.0 grade point average." "Listen to your older brothers for once," Art said concerningly. Although Gaston can be thick-headed sometimes, he has a point. Gaston smiled. "See? I do have a point. Wait a minute. Who are you calling thick-headed?" "Come on, guys. Can't you just explain to Mom that my science grade is this close to becoming a B+?" she said, and displayed a tiny fragment of air in between her fingers. "She'll have to let me go. You know how she is about bees." "What's in it for us?" Gaston asked after a long pause. "I won't bruise the back of your neck again," Franny promised. Gaston shivered, placing his hand over his neck. He still felt the faint bruise that Franny had left when she karate-chopped him for not listening to her. It was as long as his pointer finger and as thick as a pencil. Even though that was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, it still hurt whenever he bent his head. He quickly concealed it under his shirt again. "All right, fine. We've got a deal," he said. Franny smiled in triumph. "Good! And don't set me up again," she said, sounding murderous. "Or there'll be more than just a bruise next time." "See ya," she said cheerfully, then skipped over to the table where Louis was sitting. Lizzie left early every day for some reason. She wouldn't say why. Franny placed her lunchbox, which matched her backpack, next to Louis's seat and sat down. She began to ramble on about something that had to do with frogs, and that they had more singing potential than all the best singers in the world combined. "Look at her," Gaston whispered to his brother. "I think she's flirting with him." "Don't be ridiculous," Art said, finishing his last slice of pepperoni pizza. "She's probably just talking about how excited she is that she's able to come over." "Whatever," Gaston managed to say, through a mouthful of spaghetti, which stained his mouth with tomato sauce. "Dude, wipe your face," Art said, disgusted, handing his younger brother a napkin. Gaston wiped his mouth with it and tossed it into the garbage can. He eyed Louis and Franny wearily, stroking his chin. "Gaston, just let her grow up," Art sighed, tossing his paper plate into the garbage can. "Whatever," Gaston snapped, putting his backpack on his shoulder. "See you." "See you." "After school, Robinson Manor." "Wow," Franny said in awe, staring at the Robinson Manor with her jaw slack. "It's huge." "Hiya, Cornelius," Bud said, from behind the trees that were growing. He was surrounded by huge piles of leaves, which actually turned out to be from him chopping off the branches. "Cornelius?" Franny asked in surprise. "Yeah, it's his nickname for me." "Hi, Dad," Louis said, hugging Bud. "So, who's that cutie you brought over?" he asked, with a wide grin on his face. Franny blushed and pretended to be distracted by playing with the tiny froggy plush on her backpack's zipper. "Oh, that's Franny. We're working on a project together for science class," Louis stammered. "All right, then. Don't want to keep you two from your studies. Go inside," Bud said, gesturing to the huge door. They walked into the house, inhaling the ethereal scent of fresh-baked chocolate chip cookies. Franny followed Louis to the kitchen, where they found Lucille wearing an apron and oven mitts, pulling the 2 trays of cookies out of the oven. "Welcome home, sweetie," Lucille said, rushing over and kissing Louis on the forehead. "Wait, I thought you were supposed to be at work," Louis said, puzzled. "Well, my boss said I could take a week off since he heard I adopted you." "Oh, okay," Louis replied. Peeking behind Louis, she caught a glimpse of Franny. "Hi," she greeted her. "Hi, Mrs. Robinson," she said. "I saw you at the science fair 2 weeks ago." "Oh, that's right," Lucille said. "Your frogs were superb. You can call me Lucille, by the way." "All right then, Lucille," Franny smiled. "Mom, Franny and I are working on a science project." "Ooh, a science project," Lucille exclaimed. "Well, you two go up to Louis's room and get yourself situated, and I'll bring up some cookies and milk." "Thanks," they both said in unison. Before he left, Lucille whispered in Louis's ear, "She's pretty, and smart too. Is she your girlfriend?" "Mom," Louis said in embarrassment. "I'm just kidding," she laughed. Louis laughed too, and caught up to Franny, who was somewhat lost in the hall. "I can't believe your house is this big," she said in wonder. "And your parents are awesome." "Yeah, I'm pretty blessed," he replied. Franny looked around in confusion. "Where are the stairs?" she asked. "Well, you see," Louis said. "Instead of stairs, we have these," Louis said, pointing towards a teleportation tube. "How do they work?" Franny asked. Louis led her over to the tube until they were only about a foot from it. "How do they work?" Franny asked again. Like this, Louis said, pushing Franny under the tube. Franny screamed as she traveled through the air-compressed tube and landed on Louis's bed. She moved out of the way just before Louis fell too. "Wasn't that fun?" Louis asked. "Yeah," Franny smiled. But then she punched Louis. "Ow!" he exclaimed, gripping his arm. "What was that for?" "For scaring me out of my mind," Franny smirked. "Anyways, we should get started on our paper," Louis said, shaking the matter off. "Sure," Franny said with a smile. "Meanwhile—" "Ow, stop it!" Art said with muffled voice. "Your foot is on my nose!" "I can't help it," Gaston passively said. "It's not my fault these windows are so freaking high." "Why did I ever agree to help you do this?" Art grumbled. "I have an English project due next." "Shush! Now Mrs. Robinson's giving them cookies." "Cookies?" Art asked. As if on cue, his stomach grumbled, causing him to sigh. "Look at the little girl," Gaston said, frowning. "She thinks she's all that in a tray of cookies." "She's only 12, his older brother muttered. "She's got the attitude of a stuck-up 16-year-old, his brother shot back. "But that Louis kid, he's not bad," Art said. "I think the only reason Franny's hanging out with him is because he's a 12-year-old Albert Einstein," Gaston observed. Louis was observing the fake frogs' insides and jotting down notes, while Franny sat on the floor and doodled a picture of her frogs in tuxedos and singing into microphones. What are they even doing? Louis is doing all the work when Little Miss Music Princess draw pictures of her silly pet frogs singing. "Franny's not like that," Art protested. "That's what you think," Gaston said, rolling his eyes. "Well, I'll admit that she can be a bit—" "Wait! They're doing something," he said, immediately shushing his brother. Franny was trying to open a cabinet, but with no success. She called to Louis, who also failed at opening the cabinet. They both grabbed the cabinet handle and pulled. Eventually it popped open, and Louis and Franny flew backwards about 3 feet away. Franny landed on top of Louis, causing Gaston to gasp. "What's going on?" Art demanded rather loudly. "Franny and Louis are—" "Hey, what are you boys doing here?" Another voice called out. Their stomachs tightened in shock. They were so surprised they had no words. "I said, what are you boys doing here?" Bud repeated. Gaston lowered himself down from Art's shoulders and walked up to Bud. "Hello, sir. My name is Gaston, and this is my brother Art," he said, gesturing to Art, who smiled and waved. "And why are you here?" he asked. "Our younger sister Franny is over, and we were, checking on her," Art said. "I see," Bud said. "Well, I should call the cops for trespassing on private property," he continued. Gaston and Art looked at each other. Their expressions seemed to say, "It was nice knowing you. I'm glad you were my brother. But since you meant no harm, I'll let you go." The two teenagers sighed in relief. Thank you, mister," Gaston stuttered. Bud laughed. "Please call me Bud." They smiled and said their goodbyes and were on their way. "That was a close call," Art said sternly with a touch of relief in his voice. "Tell me about it," Gaston said. "No more eavesdropping for us," his older brother declared. "That I second," Gaston said. Chapter 4, Queen of Frogs. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, Louis," Franny exclaimed, quickly getting up and helping Louis up. "It's okay, Franny, really," he said. "Are sure?" she asked. "Yeah, totally. I'll fix that cabinet later." Franny ran over to the cabinet and pulled out the notebook Louis had asked her to get. She handed it to him and closed the cabinet. Louis went back straight to work and occasionally took a bite out of his cookie. Franny went back to drawing her frogs, and after she was done, she hid it inside her binder. "So, what are you doing, Louis?" Franny asked, walking over to Louis's cluttered desk. "Well, I already finished our research for the project, so now I'm studying the frog's voice box. It actually turns out that frogs do have more singing potential than humans. By adjusting the amount of breath they use, they can... He rambled on that frogs could adjust the pitch of their voice, and scientifically explained how. Franny listened on in delight. So, you think that my frogs could do that? Definitely, if they were willing to. Of course they're willing to. Perfect, Lewis said. You can bring them over tomorrow, and I'll take a look. Sure, Franny replied ecstatically. Never before had anyone ever taken such an interest in her frogs. You're the best, Lewis, she gushed. It's nothing, he said, blushing slightly. Hey, what's that on your face? Franny asked after a long pause. What? That streak of chocolate, she said, pointing to the side of his cheek. What streak of chocolate? He asked. I'll get it, she said, cleaning off the gooey chocolate with her finger. Lewis's cheeks burned as her finger ran across his cheekbone, and Franny blushed insanely. Franny went to wash her finger off, and Lewis stammered a thank you. Lewis placed his hand on the part of his face that Franny had touched, his cheeks turning pink. Before he could fangirl any longer, Franny walked back into the room, and telling him that her brothers were here to pick her up. They said their goodbyes, and Franny gathered her stuff to go. Isuna, you're welcome to come back again tomorrow, Lucille said as Franny walked out the door. Thank you, I will, she replied. Safe trip, Bud called out as the three siblings walked towards the sidewalk. Poor Lewis, Gaston said, eyeing Franny, doing all the work by himself while the Queen of Frogs doodles away. What? How did you know? She stammered. You just told me, he replied with a smirk. I asked him if he wanted help, Franny said with a frown. But he told me that he was almost done anyways, and we would just go over it tomorrow. Yeah, right, Gaston said. Wait a minute, Franny said, walking behind Art. She pulled out a branch stuck on the side of his shoe. This is a branch from the shrubs at the Robinson Manor, she said. Gaston and Art glanced at each other uneasily. Franny examined them again and raised an eyebrow. And Art has a muddy footprint on his shoulder. Her eyes darted down to the bottom of Gaston's shoe, which was stained with mud. You were eavesdropping on me and Lewis, weren't you? She stated, her voice steely and cold. No, Gaston stuttered. The light bruise on his neck tingled. You're lying, Franny said accusingly. Okay, fine. You got us, Gaston admitted. But we couldn't help it. We just wanted to make sure you were okay, Art said. Well, I can assure you, if you're within 5 feet of me in the next 5 seconds, you will not be okay. The two brothers raced forward in an attempt to escape their sister's fury. Franny huffed back home and went up to her room immediately, locking the door behind her. She finished the remainder of her homework and lay down in her bed. Those two jerks didn't know just who they were dealing with here. She heard a loud banging on her door. Franny, it's dinner time! Gaston's voice leaked through the bottom of the door. Not hungry, she grumbled. Well, aren't you a little ray of sunshine? He shot back sarcastically. Mom made okonomiyaki. Her stomach growled. Okonomiyaki was one of her favorite foods. Her mom was Japanese, while her dad was Italian, but he passed away a few months before she was born. Fine, she sighed, walking out of her room. Gaston smirked triumphantly. The scent of fresh griddled okonomiyaki wafted up through the hallway and entered Franny's nose. Nothing like her mom's delicious cooking to get her up into good spirits. Sit down, dear, her mother instructed her. Art was already there, chomping away at the homemade meal heartily. Her mother set down her pair of oven mitts and tucked her glossy black hair behind her ear. She had long, waist-length raven hair tied into a neat braid in the back, and wore a simple lavender blouse that reached her forearms and a white knee-length skirt, but she was a part-time conductor for a famous orchestra. And during her time conducting, she wore her hair up in a bun tied with a red ribbon, and a black long-sleeve dress with the skirt having black and white stripes, with an orange polka dot design. She looked stunningly beautiful like Franny, but had Gaston's sense of humor and art's caring nature. She smiled and pulled out Franny's chair, placing a steaming hot slice of the okonomiyaki in front of her. Franny thanked her mom and took a bite from the hot griddle food. If there was anything that she loved best in life, it was her mom's okonomiyaki. It tasted good enough to have been made by a professional chef, but had that homemade taste that made Franny love it so much. After she had finished, she thanked her mom, brushed her teeth, and laid down in bed. The warm food made her sleepy, and soon she found that she was falling asleep. Normally, she had her stomach in knots, thinking up an excuse to tell her teacher for not finishing her assignment. You know you've done this. But knowing that Louis was her project partner, she had nothing to worry about. It was almost as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Although, another thing that weighed upon her was what Gaston had said before. Poor Louis, doing all the work while the Queen of Frogs doodles away. No, Louis insisted that he do the project himself, but he seemed so enthusiastic about it. Suddenly, Franny didn't seem so sure she could sleep as easily. Frustrated, she decided to just let go of it all and get some rest. After all, he had to keep his promise. She kept her end of the deal. It was about time he did his. Chapter 5. Hold still, Frankie. Frankie, open your mouth, Franny commanded her frog. The green creature stared back at her blankly. Louis laughed. Let me see him, he said, prompting Franny to hand over her precious star. He placed the frog into a small cardboard box, with a window cut into it that was small enough that Frankie couldn't jump out, but large enough for Louis to do his work. Louis took a clean popsicle stick and gently placed it against the roof of the frog's mouth, and lifted it up, opening the mouth. Frankie started to squirm a bit, but Frankie held him still. It's for your own good. Frankie let out a small whimper-like croak. Louis investigated the frog's throat, and after a good 5 minutes or so, he removed the popsicle stick. Incredible! The frog's vocal cords are actually much more suited to singing than a human's, Louis said in awe. Franny squealed in absolute delight. The boy launched into a full explanation of a frog's vocal cords, and their density, and how it differs from an average human's. After he was done, he searched something up on his laptop and printed it out, then handed it to Franny. Gee, Franny, you might want to have your frogs practice some, scales, I think they're called, he said. Franny smiled. Will do, Louis. Oh, and her cheeks flushed a raspberry color, but she then lunged at him and hugged him tightly. Thank you so much, Louis, she gushed. Nobody's ever cared for my frogs the way you do. Well, he said, adjusting his glasses shyly. His cheeks were also rosy. You held up your end of the deal, so it's only fair that I do the same. The music princess smiled. You're a good friend, Louis. Louis only had time to grin when Bud knocked on the door, saying, Franny, dear, your brothers are here. Coming, Franny called out. Thanks again, Louis. See you later. She shouldered her backpack and left as Louis said goodbye as well. Bud leaned against the door and smiled at Louis after she had left. So, Cornelius, has Cupid paid you a little visit? He teased. What? Franny's just a friend. Louis sputtered, blushing again. I don't blame you. His adoptive father laughed. She's a pretty one. Huh, Dad. Okay, but just remember that when you grow up and have kids, you'll feel the same way when your son starts to like a girl. How do I do that? Louis tilted his head. Bud paused. Do what, son? Have kids of my own. His eyes widened even more underneath his glasses, and he shifted uncomfortably. You should go ask your mother. She'll tell you. Mother knows best after all, right? But why can't you tell me? His son asked. Well, he began to scratch his head when Lucille called out, "Honey, can I please have some help down here?" "Coming, dear," Bud called out, relieved. He turned to Louis. "We'll, talk later, son, okay?" "Okay, Dad." It was recess time the next day when Franny brought all of her frogs to show the class for the end of their frog project. She had the large box in her arms when suddenly she felt something, or someone to be exact, trip her. She yelled in surprise as she fell onto the concrete ground, her frogs spilling out of the box. "Well, well, Franny," a snarky voice said from above her. "Clumsy as ever, aren't we?" "What business is it of yours, Cindy?" Franny said, getting up and dusting off her shorts. "Oh, nothing. Just making sure you know where your place is. Teacher's pet." She examined her manicured nails. She had dark brown hair tied up into a tight bun and pale skin with harsh blue frozen eyes. She would have been pretty if not for the makeup caked on and the scowl always smeared onto her face. Franny gasped when she saw her frogs on the ground. "My frogs!" she exclaimed, picking up the box and scooping one in. "They're absolutely disgusting," Cindy sneered, poking one with the side of her foot. "Hey, stop that," Franny growled. "Or what?" the other girl taunted, pushing the frog around even more. The poor animal seemed traumatized. "Or I'll—" Franny was suddenly shoved from the back by another girl and landed on the ground hard. Her chin was scraped and bleeding, as well as the bottom of her palm, wrist, and left knee. The other girls behind her laughed as Cindy teased, "You got a little something under your chin." Franny tried to get up, but her knee was bruised bad. She crumpled. "Oh, look at her!" Cindy exclaimed. "She looks like one of her dumb frogs." "You look more like a pig," Franny snarled. Cindy's brows furrowed in rage. She kicked the frog that she had been tormenting before, slamming it against the wall. It stopped moving. "No!" Franny screamed, starting to cry. "George! No! George, huh? That's a dumb name." The rest of her posse joined in on the laughter. "That's it!" Franny yelled in rage. Even Cindy was taken aback a bit. What happened next, no one was ready for. Franny lunged at Cindy, kicking her in the stomach and then karate-chopping her neck. The girl shriveled in pain as her friends tried to restrain Franny, only to each be violently punched away. All of them ran away screaming as Franny continued to beat the living life out of Cindy, tears of rage and sadness flowing down her cheeks. Cindy could only scream for help and for her friends to come back when Mrs. Crobber came running out and had to pull Franny off of Cindy. "Miss Framagucci, you'll be sent to the principal's office immediately," the teacher said firmly. "She killed my pet frog," Franny sobbed, pointing to the wall where George's dormant carcass lay. Her teachers looked softened for a moment, but then firmed up again. "We'll have to sort this out with Mr. Wickman," was all she said. "Hey, Franny," Louis said softly. In his hands was Franny's box, along with a smaller one. Franny was waiting in the principal's office, her eyes still red from crying. "Hi, Louis," she said weakly. He set down the larger box containing the frogs next to her. Louis looked down before handing her the smaller box. George didn't make it. He died of trauma and had a broken spine. Franny gasped and began to sob again. Louis looked like he was about to say something when a voice called out, "Franny Framagucci, Mr. Wickman's ready for you."